Hey everyone, welcome back to Toast and Topics. Today we're joined by Michael Beckley, an associate professor of political science at Tufts University and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Mike is a leading voice challenging the idea that the United States is in decline relative to China. His research shows that when you look beyond raw GDP numbers, the US still holds a significant edge over its competitors. He has written multiple books, including Unrivaled, published in 2018, where he argues that America's economic, technological, and geographic advantages will allow it to remain the world's sole superpower. More recently, he co authored Danger Zone, published in 2022, where he warns that the real danger in the international system is not a smoothly rising China, but a peaking one with debt, demographic collapse, and slowing growth. We're really grateful to have Mike on with us today. Mike, thanks a lot for being on the show and welcome to Toast and Topics.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, Mike, it's great to have you on. I've been following your work and a fan of it for quite some time now. So this conversation, I hope, will be exciting and productive. I wanted to start with your book, Unrivaled, which makes a powerful case that America will, as the subtitle suggests, remain the world's sole superpower. And I was hoping that you could highlight a couple of the key reasons that you came to that conclusion. And specifically, it would be great if, in addition to sort of the top level findings, you could share why you chose to focus on net measures rather than gross measures in the book. And then finally, I'd be curious, 7 years on, how you think the thesis of the book has held up.
Yeah, so the book is basically a giant accounting exercise, and the first part really tries to figure out what has made great powers powerful over the last couple of centuries, and that's where this idea of net wealth or net resources come in. Because a lot of our standard measures, things like GDP, military spending, trade volumes, are all gross measures, so you're not deducting costs. And so they systematically exaggerate the power and wealth of countries like China, India, that have huge populations. So they have big economies, big militaries, but they also got a lot of costs because they have to feed, clothe, house, clean up after, protect, control, more than 1 billion people. And so what I did was first, let's look at what has actually made countries powerful. So the first part of the book looks at international disputes, it looks at wars, and it looks at long-term great power rivalries. And I found that the side that has greater net resources rather than gross resources wins about 70% of international disputes, 80% of wars, and every single one of the great power rivalries. And I think both China and Russia's history illustrate this very well. So China in the 19th century had the largest economy. It was the top manufacturer by output. It had this tributary system with these trade flows, a humongous military, but it obviously got bested by smaller but more efficient powers like Britain, which had half the GDP, but more than twice the amount of net resources. And then eventually the Japanese, who also are much smaller but more efficient power. And same thing with Russia. Russia was the largest economy and military in Europe, but it got demolished by the Germans because the Germans were just way more efficient and had greater net resources. So I established that and then basically took that framework and said, okay, how does the United States and China stack up today? And I found that when you subtract out all of the liabilities in China's wealth, the massive debt, the fairly unproductive and excess capacity generating economy, and in the military, this military that while it's very large, China's in a rough neighborhood, and so its military power is stretched thin, defending all of its borders. It's just a lot less impressive, and that the U.S. lead is much more substantial. And then the second half of the book looks at the future prospects of those great powers, their demographic profiles, how their institutions are doing, and just the resources and geography, these kind of deep drivers of power. And I found that even there, nothing is guaranteed, but the US just has better prospects, has more advantages over China long term. In terms of what has changed, I mean, I think the main thing that has changed is since I wrote the book, China has engaged in the largest peacetime military expansion of any country since Nazi Germany, just ramping up defense spending and churning out missiles and ammo and warships and aircraft at 5 to 6 times the American rate. And unfortunately, the United States and its allies have been very slow to respond, to mobilize their tremendous latent resources and translate them into hard assets on the ground. So that's why I become much more concerned about the local military balance in East Asia and especially in the Taiwan Strait, and vis-a-vis the Philippines and the South China Sea than I was at the time that I wrote the book. I did the research, 10 years ago or something like that. So I think that's the main thing that has changed. I mean, there's a bunch of other stuff as well, China's industrial policies that we can get into. But I think the overall, if you take a long-term perspective, China's been basically slamming its foot down on the gas pedal. And while it's dominating solar and EVs and certain types of computer chips, but it's also racked up enormous additional liabilities. And so I think the longer term you look, the worse that China's prospects look. And so that part I think has held up. And I guess we'll find out in a couple of decades whether I should find another line of work, or whether everything turns out basically the way that I forecasted in that book.
That's great. And wealth is a key net measure that you focus on in the book. And some might argue that wealth might not translate directly to power in a crisis. For instance, manufacturing capacity or military manpower could matter more in wartime. So, how do you address the concern that your analytical focus underestimates China's mass industrial base or its ability to mobilize its huge population?
I think in the short term, that's exactly right. And that's why, the next book is called Danger Zone, not like Happy Zone, because that's exactly the thing I worry about is that, yes, in the long term, we're talking about like half a century, the US looks like it has all these advantages, but that's not going to matter if China just mobilizes quicker and then thrashes American forces in the Taiwan Strait or buries American manufacturers in a glut of industrial goods that it's churned out. So this is, I mean, in my other work, I've talked extensively about America is not very good at like mobilizing for big foreign policy objectives until after it gets punched in the face. Then it tends to mobilize big time, after Pearl Harbor or after 9/11. But that is my biggest worry today is that the US, we're kind of watching China really just make a go for it. I think their timeline is much shorter than what we seem to think. And so I think that if you want to phrase that as a criticism, I think that's exactly right, basically, that China's manufacturing juggernaut and its military modernization really pose a huge threat to the United States and its allies.
Yeah, very interesting. And there are a lot of different directions that we could go with those comments. But I wanted to quickly bring it back to Danger Zone, the book that you just mentioned. Before we dive into China's manufacturing in greater detail, for example, it would be great if you could just, outline the overall thesis of Danger Zone, the book that you co-wrote with Hal Brands, and what that might indicate we should be expecting over the course of the 2020s with respect to U.S.-China relations.
Yeah, so after I wrote the first book, and was pretty sure that China's economy was going to slow, I started looking into what happens when great powers who have been rising rapidly for decades start to hit greater economic and geopolitical headwinds. And I found to my horror that they basically all, like none of them just kind of like dial back and mellow out and say, well, we gave it a good try. I guess we'll just become second ranked powers. They all do what China and I think Russia as well are doing today, which is they say, you know what, if we have fewer sticks or fewer carrots to throw around because other countries are less enthralled by our booming, rapidly rising economies, well, then we'll just invest more in sticks to bludgeon people to act right. We've just stocked up a bunch of potential muscle with decades of rapid economic growth. Even though things don't look good in the future, we can translate that. And in fact, because the future right now, based on long-term trends, doesn't look so great for us, that's all the more reason to make bigger moves in the present to try to reset some of those long-term trends. So, it's a lot of the classic cases. You have Germany and Japan obviously don't react particularly well to the increasing pressures that they have. But Putin's Russia, I think, was a resurgent power in the 2000s, banging out like 7 to 8% economic growth rates. Then after the 2008 financial crisis, when those go down, Putin starts looking for other revenue streams, and he wants this Eurasian Economic
Yeah.
Union, tries to corrupt, right? So like eventually that escalates to the war in Ukraine. So I was looking at all of that. Hal Brands, great historian, probably the most prolific grand strategist of my generation,
He's
has
awesome.
had also written a piece for, I think, the American Interest it was, on sort of the geopolitical encirclement angle. So I was more focused on the economic slowdown angle. He was more focused on, Germany before World War I, feeling like there was this ring of encirclement against them, and their solution to that was not to back down, but to try to slam through it. We started talking a lot about that, looking at what we were seeing from Beijing, and said, you know what, this it looks like China is going down this ugly path. We need to sound the alarm bell as quickly as possible. And so we wrote that book and then a whole bunch of articles based on it.
And on that note, could you describe in a little more detail some of the structural features of China's economy that brought you to the conclusion that they are a peaking power?
Yeah, so I think China has a number of, like, a theory of power that I think can produce some major gains and leverage, but overall is rough. One is the just emphasis on gross resources, growth, just pump stuff out at any
Yeah.
cost. We've talked about that already. The second is um, focusing on leading sectors, or what they call strategic or emerging industries, at the expense of the broader macroeconomic health of the system. And I think, in particular, Jeff Ding's work has really shown that historically that actually hasn't been the case. That when you try to just pump up these strategic industries, you end up like the Soviets, who had these islands of excellence surrounded by a sea of stagnation that ultimately undid the system. And I think you're seeing that today, because all of these industries that China's pumping money into are still a relatively small share of the economy. They're like 10%, I think, if you
Hmm.
add them. The real estate sector and the construction sector together were like 30% of the economy, and those have erased about $18 trillion in household wealth just over the last few years. Chinese people had more than twice the amount of their net worth invested in real estate as Americans did on the eve of the 2008 financial crisis, and China's losses have been much worse. And so this is why, disposable incomes in China are like $5,800, and why there's no consumption. Consumption's stuck at like 39% of GDP. So there's no demand pull in the Chinese economy. As a result, they have to export, but that's not that may have worked in the 1990s, the go-go globalization era, but in a world of rising protectionism, geopolitical conflict, and shrinking consumer markets around the world because of demographics, this export-led juggernaut, I think, is going to run into a whole bunch of problems, and it's obviously racked up all these liabilities like debt along the way. Then another is an area that Ben, is sort of leading the charge with, which is, I think China assumes it can get a lot of leverage through just sheer scale, and in many ways it has. I mean, you saw with the rare earths being able to kind of cajole the Americans back to the table in the trade deal. But I think what Ben and Steve Brooks' research shows is that what they call excludable commercial advantage, or I'm sorry, Ben, if I'm
No,
if
that's
I'm
it.
using this, but basically the
Suitable
idea
commercial
that
power.
it actually matters to like do really well in the high tech areas that you can't replace. Like, what do you think is easier to replace? The rare earths that China mines, or the high end semiconductors that the United States and its allies can put together and that China can't? And that longer term, that is going to lead to a lot more commercial leverage, as well as insulation, if the what hits the fan, and there's just like a total trade cutoff, as Ben and Steve model in their book. So in other words, like, China has a number of strengths, but the problem is that it's all based on theories of what actually makes countries powerful, that, at least in the broad sweep of history, at least since the industrial era, hasn't worked out so well.
Yeah, again, there are a lot of places that we could go with those comments. Thank you. One area from Danger Zone that I wanted to spend a bit more time on, however, is the like set of scenarios that could manifest over the course of the 2020s, in which China, recognizing that its economic potential is somewhat limited going forward, actually launches some kind of an act of aggression, specifically against Taiwan. And so, just in that vein, when do you think China's leaders could, view themselves as being in a kind of now or never moment in which they, kind of need to take action against a territory like Taiwan in the present in order to, cement some of their long-term geopolitical ambitions?
I think, unfortunately, this is the Hawk's dilemma, because on the one hand, if you're the United States or Taiwan, you need to militarize very quickly to slam the door shut on China to reinforce deterrence such that it's clearer than truth, not just clear to the
Yep.
average person on the street, but clear to a dictator who's surrounded by sycophants, who has dreams of greatness and his historical legacy, who's thinking about organ transplants to make him live forever. I mean, the guy doesn't seem like the most modest person. You have to convince him that this would not work out. So you have to really ramp up. But the problem is that just accentuates if the Chinese are looking and saying, oh, in 10 years, the Taiwan Strait is going to be a high-tech minefield that there's no way we could blast through. Well, then we have this huge military right now. Why don't we just go for it? And so there's no timeline. I mean, China watchers have been very clear, and I think correctly, that it's not like there's like a set timeline that China is working
Hmm.
on. Just think, this is the classic situation of you're just looking ahead, you're making projections about what the balance of forces is going to look like. And if you've rushed out to a lead in the way that China has, why wouldn't you want to go in the latter half of the 2020s? Why would you want to wait for the Americans to get their act together in the 2030s? So, at the end of the day, it's not like I think war is inevitable. I think there's like maybe a 10% to 15% chance of this actually happening, but it's just that is still way too high for me to sleep comfortably at night. And so that's
Yep.
why trying to figure out ways to slam that door shut without then provoking the exact response that we're all fearing. That's such a difficult strategy to pull off.
Yep. That's helpful. It's the window of greatest risk and not necessarily, a prophecy of imminent doom.
Right.
Yeah, great.
Let's pivot a little bit to the US. You've written that by all appearances, the US is a quote mess domestically, and yet the global order remains firmly American led. So, can you talk about that contrast a little bit more? How has the US been so economically dominant while experiencing such political polarization and somewhat of turmoil at home?
Yeah, I think this is like the central paradox that I've spent a big part of my professional life pondering because it is such a paradox. I mean, every day I wake up and it just looks almost like the United States is trying to decline. I mean, just if you think about the 21st century, the US has had its worst economic catastrophe since the Great Depression, the biggest foreign attack on the American homeland ever, two of the three longest wars at enormous cost, and then obviously this political polarization that's at, civil war levels. And yet, I'm writing a paper right now for Foreign Affairs, and it shows that 9 out of the 10 largest economies in the world are all shrinking relative to that of the United States. Only India is like barely keeping pace, and for a number of reasons, I don't think that's going to last very long. And so it's like the US is like trying to do everything wrong, and yet still somehow has at least an economic lead and better prospects than these other countries. And so that's the dilemma. And to me, it just reinforces the idea that if you're talking about long-term power trends, it's not driven by particular personalities, it's by these big structural factors like geography, demography, and then the rooted political institutions. And so in the piece that you referenced, Sachin, I go through the fact that the US has the best piece of real estate in the world, this resource-packed thing that is surrounded by a couple of friends and huge oceans that make it easy to trade but hard to invade. It has the best demographic profile among the great powers. It's the only one that's projected to have a growing working age population throughout this century. In fact, there's going to be a 250 million working age person swing between the United States and China just over the next 25 years. And then you factor in the seniors, where China's going to gain more than 100 million more seniors than the United States is. So it's just, a catastrophic swing from China's perspective, but a huge benefit to the US because it sucks up people from the rest of the world. And then the political situation, that's the biggest Achilles heel, I think. But as I did more research, I realized that, at least for long-term wealth generation, this highly decentralized system that produces a lot of political paralysis, a lot of grandstanding, a lot of absurdity, actually kind of like gets out of the way and lets this vibrant private sector do its thing. And when I dialed into productivity indicators and business startup formation and all these other things that you all at Stanford know so much better than I do, it was astounding to me just how much greater it was than all of these European powers, for example, or the Japanese or anyone else that, for most of my childhood, people were lecturing me about how the Americans are so dumb and they can't possibly compete with any of these better democratic systems. And lo and behold, when I was a kid, the Japanese were 50% richer on a per capita basis than we were here in the United States. Today,
Yeah.
Americans are 140% richer than the average Japanese citizen. So, I mean, it just shows you the power of these broader structural forces to just plow through the day-to-day absurdities that we read about in the newspaper.
Yeah, that's great. And I think broadly we're, in agreement on the advantages that the US has, including in, many of its political institutions. This is one area that I've been, thinking about more recently. However, for example, Dan Wang in his new book Breakneck described China as an engineering state and the US, on the other hand, as a lawyerly society, right? And essentially, the idea is just that Chinese leaders can focus on building fast and big, which they've done with some success. Granted, that's racked up a huge amount of debt for them. Whereas the US really does, in many ways, prioritize process in its decision making, compliance, and ultimately, a lot of its initiatives do tend to bog down in litigation. And so, even though the US is hyper powerful in a lot of important respects, I'm curious if you've given any thought to this point about America's ability to build and whether its, seeming lack of that as compared to China at the moment is going to, present significant problems for it, not just in the military domain, but also in the domain of technology competition.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not going to defend lawyers, even though many of my friends are lawyers, and I
Yeah.
certainly think
I'm
Dan.
doing a JD PhD at Stanford right now,
I
and
don't
so
know if
I'm struggling with this characterization too, but there may be something to it. So
yeah, I
I'd
mean,
love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, this is one. I mean, look, I haven't read Dan Wong's book yet, but I understand that it's probably extremely good and insightful in many ways. I think the lawyers versus engineers thing, I mean, that's a good way to kind of grab. It's like the Tiger Mom thing, that Amy Chu, it's like a good way to kind of try to capture a kernel of truth and then make it interesting so that people will buy the book and then read all the deeper insights. Because, I look at this is one of these things of like, oh, the Chinese have a plan that's like a century long, whereas Americans only think short term. Or I remember people were saying the same thing about the Japanese. They're all engineers and good at math and science, whereas Americans are dumb, social studies kind of lawyers and stuff. So I always take this with a bit of a grain of salt, but I do think that the big kernel of truth, obviously, is that what China's system is really good at is taking a bazooka of capital and just blowing it at building stuff. And so they did that in the real estate sector and infrastructure for several decades. And when they had, built twice as many roads and high-speed rail as they needed, they realized, hey, let's focus on other sectors of the economy. And that's why they're turning that bazooka onto these strategic manufacturing industries with great effect in many areas. I mean, they produce more solar panels and EVs and rare earths and some computer chips than the rest of the world combined at this point. And they have cratered and bankrupted competitors around the world and kind of monopolized those markets. So that I think is a huge mercantilist threat. And then I think the additional point that folks like Dan Wong would probably make is that this then can translate into military mobilization capacity. And that could be a huge shift from, in previous wars like World War II, the US could afford to like sit back and be lazy and get punched in the face and then mobilize over several years and just bury their competitors with manufacturing prowess. But China, I think, has learned from that and said, we're going to take that advantage because we're just a bigger country demographically than the Americans. We're also going to seed all of their infrastructure with malware so that we can cripple their homeland if there is a big war so that they can't get back on their feet. So these are all massive threats. And I think especially, again, it's this near-term, long-term thing. I think if we're talking about a near-term crisis, like over something Taiwan, this is a potentially big threat. I mean, Ben, I'd love to hear from you at some point because one counterpoint to that is I'm not so sure China's manufacturing juggernaut can continue to produce if China is cut off from one of the many of the 600 plus products that it is like 70 to 100% reliant on the United States and its allies for many critical inputs, high tech, but also raw materials. It could also be just choked out from oil. So part of me thinks, the United States would basically strangle the Chinese economy as you've laid out. But even setting that aside, I mean, again, let's say China has this near-term advantage. I do think in the long term, I'd still rather have the corrective mechanisms of a litigious, lawyerly society that because I've just seen so many catastrophic things in China where they've spent, I don't know how much of the Chinese citizens' money on these apartment complexes that they're now just tearing down because they couldn't find anyone to live in them, or flooding the market and creating these price wars so that the EVs and the solar panels, many of them are being sold at below cost. And China's now stuck in this deflationary doom loop. They've had 9 consecutive quarters of deflation. That's a record, and I don't know how that's going to go away because they've just pumped up these industries with so much money. Even Xi Jinping just gave this speech where he's like, does every city in China have to have an industrial park churning out EVs and computer chips? Like, that's not really what I meant, you all, but that's the incentive structure that's given by this subsidy-driven economy. So I think, we need to hold multiple truths in our minds at the
Yeah.
same time. Yes, China's authoritarian system has enormous mobilization capacity, and that is a huge threat to the United States and its allies. But we shouldn't assume that that means they're going to own the 21st century and therefore do what, Graham Allison and others seem to advocate, which is like, let's just get out of their way and accept spheres of influence in the world. I think if we look long term, we should be much more confident. If we can just plug these short term holes, the United States and its allies can be in a much better place.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And it is worth noting that in the United States, we had our own engineering society of sorts up until the 1960s, and the Lawyerly Society, in large part, emerged as a reaction to many of the excesses there, some of which parallel those that are in China at the present moment. That is to say, both systems have, advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm from the Mark Zuckerberg generation. And so, like, when I'm coming out of college, everyone's like, oh, you should have learned how to code. You should have spent all your time learning how to code. And I was like, oh, why didn't I do that? So I can invent some app to sell to Zuckerberg for a little bit of chump change from him. But now, like, if you spend all your time learning how to code, now ChatGPT and AI is going to come along and take your job. So I'm glad that I, spent my time reading dusty books in the stacks instead.
Yeah. Well, I'm in the same position. Agreed.
You've also argued that the US is tempted to act as a rogue superpower, one that's less reliant on allies and global institutions because of its huge domestic market, dominant currency, and trade self-sufficiency. And something that Ben has argued in his book, however, is that America's edge comes not only from self-sufficiency, but from the global reach of its corporations and their integration into allied economies, which together control the heights of technology and commerce. So, do you think that the US risks undervaluing the benefits of globalization and alliance networks if it drifts too far towards unilateralism?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, in just an absolute wealth perspective, the US will be a lot poorer if it just slaps tariffs on everyone and severs itself off. You lose all those gains from trade and efficiencies. But also from a strategic perspective, I mean, as Ben and Steve and others have shown, that's where the US advantage becomes overwhelming, where it goes from controlling half of the high tech revenues in the world to like 80+%. And Steve, in his earlier work on Western defense and technology networks, show that this is kind of how the Americans and the West buried the Soviet Union because they had these flourishing Western capitalist commercial networks that just massively outproduced what any one country could do. And I think, my colleague Chris Miller has shown in this just as one example, the United States also cannot make the most high-end computer chips. It needs the Dutch lithography machines and it needs Taiwanese manufacturing and there's so many other countries that go into that. And so if you can harness that allied scale as Rush Doshi and Kurt Campbell have been advocating and others have, that just creates an overwhelming advantage. In addition to, I just think, look, at the end of the day, I am maybe a bit ideological on this, but I just think a big advantage, both morally and strategically for the US, is to stand up for a democratic way of life, that it is extremely beneficial to Americans to exist in a world where there are other liberal democracies and they're all defending each other and banding together, because it is ultimately a fragile form of government, both internally, but as we've just discussed, it can be smashed if the authoritarians rapidly mobilize. So I just think it behooves the liberal democracies to get together because there's just higher levels of trust. They've already integrated their economies, and so why you would throw that away is, I just don't fundamentally understand, other than to say if you look at U.S. history, the U.S. has a long history prior to 1945 of just kind of doing its own thing because, frankly, it can. And even today, exports are, I think, maybe 11% of U.S. GDP, substantial, but one third of the
Yep.
global average. Basically, you're the top energy producer in the world. Like the U.S. could pull up the drawbridge. It'd be way poorer in an absolute sense, but everyone else, I think, would be even worse off because so many countries just depend on this open commercial order that the U.S., through its military, its market, its financial resources, and its technology, have helped undergird for much of the last few decades.
That's great, Mike. Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to share some of your work with us. And to our audience, we hope you enjoyed this interview. Next episode, we will be joined by Aditi Ramakrishnan, who's a scientific journalist at the Associated Press, where we'll discuss some of her recent work on light pollution at the U.S. Open Tennis Championships, as well as her burgeoning career in journalism. So thank you, Mike. Really appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Toast and Topics. Before signing off, we wanted to disclose that the views expressed in this podcast are not representative of the organizations that we are associated with. If you learned something in this episode, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Until next time.